They walked into the den of their Beverly Hills mansion in Tuxedos. Their parents were watching a movie. 25 minutes later, they called 911 in tears. Miles, ghost hunter here. 35 years later, America is still arguing about whether the Menendez brothers were calculating young men or the children of someone the public never truly knew. Keep the lights on for this one, because what I am about to walk you through is not a clean story. It is not a story where the good guys win and the bad guys lose. It is a story where the jury cried, where a therapist betrayed a patient, where a father's hidden past came back into the light decades too late, and where two brothers, now in their 50s, sit in a California courtroom in 2024, waiting to see if the country has changed its mind. We are going to start where the police started, at the front door of number 722 North Elm Drive, Beverly Hills, August 20th, 1989. You need to understand what that house meant. Beverly Hills in 1989 was not just a zip code, it was a statement. And number 722 North Elm Drive was not just a house. It was a 14-room Mediterranean-style mansion that had previously been rented by Elton John, by Prince, by Hal Prince, the Broadway producer. A revolving door of people who needed a Los Angeles palace for a few months at a time. And then, in 1988, a Cuban-American executive named Jose Menendez bought it outright for $4 million and moved his family in. Jose Menendez, 45 years old, Chief Executive Officer of Live Entertainment Corporation, a company that distributed video cassettes and music and was worth, at that point, more money than most small nations. Jose had come to the United States from Cuba as a teenager, fleeing the Castro Revolution with the clothes on his back. He had worked his way through college. He had worked his way up through RCA Records. And he had rebuilt himself in the way only first-generation immigrants with something to prove can rebuild themselves, into a hurricane. He was 5'10", compact, olive-skinned, with dark eyes that people who worked for him described as unreadable. He did not raise his voice often. He did not need to. He fired assistants for cold coffee. He berated executives in conference rooms until they sweated through their shirts. He demanded perfection from his employees, from his wife, and most of all, from his two sons. His wife, Kitty Menendez, 47 years old, born Mary Louise Anderson in the small town of Oak Lawn, Illinois. A former beauty queen, a former schoolteacher, a woman who had at one point in her life been full of plans. By August of 1989, those plans had been hollowed out. Kitty was, by every account of every person who knew her, in an unraveling marriage. Jose had been unfaithful for years. Kitty had found out about the most recent affair the year before. She had stopped leaving the house for weeks at a time. Her hair was falling out from stress. She was struggling. She was 65 pounds heavier than she had been 10 years earlier. And she was, according to the family housekeeper, frightened of something she would not name: their two sons. Lyle Menendez, 21 years old, a Princeton University student, tall, broad-shouldered, with the square jaw and the confident stride of a prep school tennis player, which is exactly what he had been. Lyle had been suspended from Princeton the year before for plagiarism. His father had been furious. His father was always furious about something. Erik Menendez, 18 years old, smaller than his brother, thinner, more delicate. A nationally ranked junior tennis player with Olympic dreams. A boy who, the housekeeper would later say, still slept with a stuffed animal at night. Erik had graduated from Beverly Hills High School 2 months earlier. He was supposed to be starting at UCLA in the fall. That was the family. The immigrant hurricane, the hollowed-out beauty queen, the prep school tennis player, the boy with the stuffed animal. Behind the gates of 722 North Elm, at approximately 10 o'clock at night, Lyle Menendez picked up the phone in the kitchen and dialed 911. His voice on that recording, and you can still find it online, and I would encourage you to listen to it because it is one of the most studied, 911 calls in American criminal history. His voice on that recording is a thing that defies easy description. He is shouting, he is sobbing, he is, at moments, coherent. At other moments, he is making sounds that are barely words. "Someone has harmed my parents," he says, over and over. The dispatcher tries to keep him on the line. She asks him who. Lyle does not know. She asks him if he saw anyone. Lyle says no. She asks him where his brother is. Lyle says Erik is in the room with him. She asks him to stay on the line. Lyle is crying. Erik, in the background, is also crying. Beverly Hills police arrive in under 4 minutes. The first officers through the door are Detective Les Zoller and his partner. What they find in the den will, over the next 7 months, become the most photographed crime scene in Los Angeles County since the Manson family cases. Jose and Kitty Menendez are gone, both of them. And the manner of what happened to them is not subtle. It is not clean. It is not the kind of scene that a burglar leaves behind. It is a scene that screams a message, even if nobody can figure out yet what the message is, or who it is for. Detective Zoller takes one look at what is in front of him and thinks, this was personal. This was close. This was someone who wanted to send a signal. The first theory, the theory that Beverly Hills Police Department will cling to for almost the entire autumn of 1989, is that Jose Menendez was targeted by organized crime. You have to understand why. Jose was an executive in the video cassette distribution business. In 1989, the video cassette distribution business was, to put it gently, not populated entirely by choir boys. There were rumors, allegations, court cases. Jose had been in a bitter dispute with a business partner named Noel Bloom, who had at various points been alleged to have ties to organized crime. Jose had recently testified against certain figures. Jose had enemies in Florida. Jose had enemies in New York. Jose had enemies in ways that most people do not have enemies. So the police look outward. They look at business rivals. They look at disgruntled former employees. They look at the adult entertainment industry, which Jose had at various points done business with. They look at Cuban emigre politics. They look at everything except the 2 young men who were sitting in the house when the events occurred. The brothers' story is this. They had gone to the movies that evening. They had gone to see Batman at a theater in Century City. They had come home around 10 o'clock. They had walked into the den. They had found their parents. They had run to the phone. They had called 911. Simple, clean, plausible. And for 7 months, the Beverly Hills Police Department accepts it. Now, I want you to hold on to something for me, because we are going to come back to this, and when we do, it is going to matter more than almost anything else in the story. I want you to hold on to the fact that when the first officers arrived at 722 North Elm Drive on the night of August 20th, 1989, there was no forced entry. None. The front gate had been open. The front door had been unlocked. Nothing was missing from the house. No jewelry, no cash, no electronics. Kitty Menendez had been wearing rings. The rings were still on her fingers. A targeted hit by professionals does not leave the jewelry on the fingers. A burglary does not skip the jewelry entirely. And a random intruder does not walk past a house full of expensive watches and priceless artwork to go directly to the den and ignore everything else. The scene made no sense. And the detectives, the good ones, the ones who had been doing this for 20 years, knew it made no sense. But the cultural pressure in Beverly Hills in 1989 to not ask uncomfortable questions about the grieving sons of a prominent entertainment executive was enormous. The Menendez family hired a public relations firm. They hired lawyers. They held a memorial for Jose and Kitty in a ceremony that made the Los Angeles Times. And the investigation, for a while, went quiet. It went quiet until the spending started. Listen carefully to what I am about to tell you, because this is the part where the entire story begins to turn. Lyle Menendez, 21 years old, bereaved and grieving, walked into a Beverly Hills jewelry store less than 1 week after the family memorial. He purchased a Rolex watch, a gold Rolex President. The price was approximately $15,000. He paid in cash. Erik Menendez, 18 years old, also bereaved, also grieving, drove to a Jeep dealership in Los Angeles. He purchased a new Jeep Wrangler. He paid in cash. In the months that followed, between August of 1989 and March of 1990, the two brothers would spend between them more than $700,000. $700,000 in 7 months. Let me walk you through some of it. Lyle bought a restaurant in Princeton, New Jersey. It was called Mr. Buffalo's. He paid $550,000 for it. He was 21 years old. He had never run a restaurant. He had never worked in a restaurant. The restaurant would fail within a year. Lyle hired a personal tennis coach. He hired a personal bodyguard. He flew around the country in first-class cabins. He rented a penthouse suite at the Bel Air Hotel for months at a time. Erik hired a full-time tennis coach as well, a man named Mark Heffernan, and paid him $50,000 plus expenses to travel with him to tournaments around the world. Erik spent $40,000 on a single computer setup. Erik bought expensive clothes, expensive watches of his own, expensive everything. The brothers commissioned a financial planner. They hired investment managers. They began making plans to access the full Menendez estate, which was valued at approximately $14 million. And Detective Les Zoller, the Beverly Hills detective who had been on the case from the first night, was watching every dollar of it. Because here is what Zoller had figured out, even before the spending began. Zoller had gone back and listened to the 911 call, not once, not twice, dozens of times. And the more he listened, the more something bothered him. The first thing that bothered him was a specific moment, about 90 seconds into the call, where Lyle Menendez says the phrase, underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, one, underscore, underscore. Zoller kept playing that back, because the first officers on the scene, the ones who had seen the den, had told Zoller that it was impossible, absolutely impossible, for anyone walking into that room to believe, even for a second, that Kitty Menendez was still alive. The scene simply did not allow for that conclusion. So why had Lyle said it? Was it hope? Was it panic? Was it a line he had rehearsed? And he had said it because he thought a grieving son would say it. The second thing that bothered Zoller was the timing. The brothers claimed they had left the house around 7:30 in the evening, gone to the Galleria Mall in Sherman Oaks, and then seen Batman at the Century City Theater. They claimed they had come home around 10 o'clock, but the Century City Theater had shown Batman at several different times that evening. When detectives pressed the brothers on exactly which showing they had seen, the answers began to shift. A 7:50 showing, a 9:50 showing, a 10:15 showing. The brothers were not sure. Their stories did not match each other. And when detectives asked for ticket stubs, the brothers did not have any. The third thing that bothered Zoller was a fact that the brothers had not volunteered, but that Zoller had discovered through straightforward police work. 2 days before the events at North Elm Drive, Lyle and Erik Menendez had driven to San Diego, to a sporting goods store called Big Five, and there, using a driver's license that did not belong to either of them, a license belonging to a young man named Donovan J. Goodrow, who had been Lyle's roommate at Princeton, they had purchased 2 firearms, 12-gauge Mossbergs, and several boxes of ammunition. The Menendez brothers, in other words, had purchased these firearms in a different county, under a fake name, 2 days before their parents were lost in the family den. By February of 1990, Detective Zoller was no longer pursuing the organized crime theory. Detective Zoller was building a file. The file had 2 names at the top of it, Lyle Menendez, Erik Menendez, and the file was growing. But Zoller, for all his suspicions, did not yet have what he needed. He did not have the weapons. They had been thrown off the side of Mulholland Drive the same night, into the ravines above the city, and they would never be recovered. Zoller did not have a witness. Zoller did not have a confession. Zoller had a pattern of suspicious behavior and a pile of receipts from Rolex dealers and Jeep showrooms. And in a case this high profile, in a neighborhood this wealthy, with lawyers this expensive, a pattern of suspicious behavior was not enough. Zoller needed someone to talk. And in the first week of March, 1990, someone did. His name was Dr. Jerome Oziel. He was a clinical psychologist. He had an office on Bedford Drive in Beverly Hills, and Erik Menendez had been his patient, on and off, for almost 2 years. Now I need to slow down here because the story of Dr. Jerome Oziel is a story in itself. It is a story that involves professional ethics, a mistress, a safety deposit box, and a woman named Judalon Smith, who would become, in the space of about 6 months, one of the most controversial witnesses in California legal history. Here is what happened. Erik Menendez, in the months following the events, had begun seeing Dr. Oziel for anxiety, for nightmares, for what Erik described as unbearable guilt. Erik's parents had arranged therapy for him back in 1988, after Erik and a friend had been involved in a series of burglaries in the Calabasas area. Jose Menendez had paid Dr. Oziel to manage Erik's problems quietly, without a police record. So when Erik needed someone to talk to after August of 1989, Dr. Oziel was the therapist he already had. On October 31st, 1989, Halloween, Erik Menendez went to Dr. Oziel's office. And Erik, over the course of several hours, told Dr. Oziel that he and his brother had been responsible for what happened to their parents. Dr. Oziel, according to his own later testimony, was stunned. He asked Erik to come back the following week and to bring his brother. Lyle came to the second session. Lyle was not stunned. Lyle was furious. Lyle, according to Dr. Oziel's account, made statements that Dr. Oziel interpreted as threatening. Lyle wanted to know exactly what Erik had said. Lyle wanted to know exactly what Dr. Oziel knew. Lyle, Dr. Oziel would later claim, implied that Dr. Oziel's safety might be at risk if he repeated any of it. Dr. Oziel did what a lot of people in that situation would do, which is panic. He went home. He recorded his memory of the session onto an audio cassette. He made backup notes. He placed copies of the tape into a safety deposit box at a Beverly Hills bank. And he did not, for the next 4 months, tell the police. What broke the dam was Judalon Smith. Judalon Smith was a woman Dr. Oziel had been having an affair with. She had been present in an adjoining room during one of the sessions, or she claimed she had been. She knew about the tapes. She knew about the confession. And in early March of 1990, after her relationship with Dr. Oziel deteriorated into something bitter and legally complicated, Judalon Smith walked into the Beverly Hills Police Department and told Detective Les Zoller everything she knew. On March 8, 1990, Detective Zoller and a team of Beverly Hills officers arrested Lyle Menendez on the driveway of 722 North Elm Drive. Lyle was 22 years old. He was pulled out of his car. He was placed in handcuffs. He was driven to the Beverly Hills jail. Erik Menendez was, at that moment, in Israel. He had been competing in a tennis tournament. When he heard about his brother's arrest, Erik flew back to Los Angeles, was met at the airport by his lawyers, and turned himself in on March 11th. He was 19 years old. But in the photographs that would fill every newspaper in America the following week, he looked like a child. The arrest made front pages from New York to Tokyo. The narrative of the Menendez case, which had been circulating in quiet whispers in Los Angeles for months, exploded into the open. 2 young men, from one of the wealthiest families in Beverly Hills, accused of walking into their own family's den and ending the lives of the 2 people who had given them everything. The prosecution's theory was simple and, on paper, airtight. Greed, $14 million. Two privileged sons who had been told, in the weeks before the events, that they were going to be cut out of their father's will. A spending spree that had made the motive obvious to anyone with a calculator. And a confession, captured on a therapist's cassette tape, locked in a Beverly Hills safety deposit box. The defense's theory was something nobody in Los Angeles was prepared for. The lead defense attorney was a woman named Leslie Abramson, 50 years old, 4'11", curly blonde hair, a voice that could cut glass, a reputation in the criminal defense bar of Los Angeles County as one of the most ferocious, most creative, and most difficult to beat trial attorneys in California. She had never lost a death penalty case. She had never taken a case she did not believe in. And she took the Menendez case, specifically Erik's case, because she sat down with Erik in a jail cell in March of 1990. And she listened to him. And she came out of that cell a different person. What Erik told her. What Lyle would eventually tell his own attorneys. What the defense would, 3 years later, attempt to place in front of a jury, was a story that had never, in the 7-month investigation, been part of the record. Was a story that Detective Les Zola had never been told. Was a story that, if true, changed everything. The story was that Jose Menendez had been mistreating his sons, behind closed doors, systematically, for years. That the mistreatment had begun when Lyle was 6 and Erik was 5. That it had continued, in Erik's case, until the summer of 1989. That Kitty Menendez had known about it. That Kitty Menendez had at times participated in the emotional dimensions of the cruelty. That the Menendez household, behind the gates of North Elm Drive, had been, for the entire childhoods of both boys, a place of fear. The defense would argue that on the night of August 20th, 1989, the brothers had believed, rightly or wrongly, rationally or irrationally, that their father was about to harm them. They had acted first, not out of greed, not out of calculation, out of a kind of desperate, cornered, decades-in-the-making fear. This was not a legal defense that American courtrooms were used to hearing. It was not self-defense in the traditional sense, because there was no immediate threat on the night of the events. Jose and Kitty had been sitting on a couch watching a movie. It was not insanity, because neither brother was claiming to have lost contact with reality. It was something the defense team called imperfect self-defense, a claim that the brothers had genuinely believed, in the moment, that their lives were at risk, even if that belief was not objectively reasonable. If the jury accepted imperfect self-defense, the charge could be reduced from first-degree murder, which carried life without parole, or in California at that time, the ultimate penalty, to voluntary manslaughter, which carried a sentence of, at most, 11 years. With time served, the brothers could walk out of prison in their early 30s. That was the legal stake. That was the war that was about to begin. The first trial started in July of 1993. Judge Stanley Weisberg presiding. Superior Court of Los Angeles County, Van Nuys branch. And Judge Weisberg, in a decision that would define the entire trial, ruled that because the prosecution was seeking the maximum penalty, and because Lyle and Erik had separate defense teams with separate strategies, the brothers would be tried together, but in front of 2 separate juries. One jury for Lyle, one jury for Erik, sitting in the same courtroom, hearing most of the same evidence, but deliberating separately. It was the first trial in California history to be conducted that way, and it was televised. Court TV had launched in 1991, and the Menendez trial was the first major case the network had been able to cover gavel to gavel. The country watched, every day, for 6 months. What the country saw was this. They saw Lyle Menendez, 25 years old, sitting at the defense table in a sweater, his hair combed neatly, his posture straight. They saw Erik Menendez, 22 years old, also in a sweater, also combed, smaller than his brother, more fragile, his eyes rimmed constantly with tears, They saw Leslie Abramson, tiny and fierce, sometimes standing on a step stool behind the podium so she could see over it, cross-examining witnesses until they dismantled themselves. They saw Dr. Jerome Oziel take the stand and play the therapy tapes, and they heard Lyle's voice, captured on Dr. Oziel's cassette, saying things that the defense had no easy answer for. They saw Judalon Smith take the stand, and they saw Leslie Abramson take Judalon Smith apart. Judalon Smith's credibility, her motives, her contradictions, her affair with Dr. Oziel, the money she stood to make from book deals. And then they saw Erik Menendez take the stand. Erik testified for, in total, more than a month. Direct examination and cross-examination. He sat in the witness chair day after day, and he told the jury the story of his childhood. He described his father. He described specific incidents. He described the dynamics of the household. He described things that, for a teenage boy to describe in open court, in front of cameras, in front of his grandmother and his aunts and uncles in the gallery, required a kind of public dismantling of the self that most people will never witness. Leslie Abramson was, during Erik's testimony, not just his lawyer. She was, some observers said, something closer to a mother he had never had. She sat next to him at the defense table. She smoothed his hair. She patted his hand. She whispered to him when he faltered. She was, depending on who you asked, either a brilliant advocate or a theatrical manipulator, but nobody denied the effect. The Erik jury watched her watch Erik, and the Erik jury, slowly, began to see Erik the way Leslie Abramson saw him, as a young man who had been broken long before the night he walked into the den. Lyle Menendez also testified, for more than a week. And here is the thing that surprised the trial watchers, and the lawyers, and the press. Lyle, who had always been the more composed brother, the brother who had walked into the jewelry store and picked out a gold Rolex like he was ordering lunch. Lyle broke down on the stand. He cried, not performatively, not briefly. He sobbed, and he could not speak. And the judge had to call recesses so he could collect himself. He described his own childhood. He described things that, according to observers, he had never told anyone, not his grandmother, not his cousins, not even his own attorneys, until the defense was already well underway. The jurors, both juries, were visibly affected. Reporters who had been in courtrooms for 30 years said they had never seen anything like it. One of the male jurors on the Lyle panel was seen wiping his eyes during a specific passage of testimony. A female juror on the Erik panel had to be excused for several minutes. The prosecution, led by a deputy district attorney named Pamela Bozanich, tried to puncture the narrative at every turn, tried to point out that none of the alleged childhood events had ever been reported, tried to hammer on the spending spree, tried to remind the juries that Jose and Kitty Menendez had been unarmed on a couch watching a movie. But the prosecution was fighting a battle that the defense had redefined. The juries went into deliberations in January of 1994. Erik's jury deliberated for 19 days. Lyle's jury deliberated for 25 days. And on January 28, 1994, both juries announced the same result: deadlock. Hung. On Lyle's jury, the split was 6-6. 6 jurors believed Lyle was guilty of first-degree murder. 6 jurors believed Lyle was guilty of voluntary manslaughter. On Erik's jury, the split was the same, 6-6, down similar lines. Every male juror on both panels, almost without exception, had voted for murder. Every female juror on both panels, almost without exception, had voted for manslaughter. Judge Stanley Weisberg declared a mistrial, and the country went, to use a technical term, collectively unsettled. The editorial pages exploded. How could 12 jurors, 24 actually across both panels, have failed to convict 2 young men who had, by their own admission on a therapist's cassette tape, ended the lives of their own parents? The cable news shows booked legal experts around the clock. The phrase, abuse excuse, entered the American lexicon. Talk show hosts mocked Leslie Abramson. Talk show hosts praised Leslie Abramson. The Menendez brothers, in their separate cells in the Los Angeles County Jail, became for the first time not just defendants, but a national argument about what a victim was and what a perpetrator was, and whether the two categories could ever overlap. The Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office, humiliated, announced that it would retry the brothers. The new prosecutor assigned to the case was a deputy district attorney named David Conn. David Conn was 40 years old, calm, methodical, unflappable. He had studied the first trial obsessively. He had watched every minute of videotape. He had interviewed former jurors. He knew exactly why the first trial had failed, and he knew exactly what he needed to do differently. He needed to take the childhood away. The second trial began in October of 1995. Same judge, Stanley Weisberg, same courthouse. But now, everything was different. First, the O.J. Simpson trial. The Simpson case had concluded just weeks earlier. The acquittal had shaken the Los Angeles legal establishment to its foundations. The perception, rightly or wrongly, was that cameras in courtrooms had turned the Simpson trial into a circus, and that the circus had benefited the defense. Judge Weisberg made a decision: no cameras. The second Menendez trial would be closed to television broadcast. The country would have to follow it through reporters and sketch artists. Second, one jury, not two. Lyle and Erik would face a single panel, together. The logistical acrobatics of the first trial were gone. The two brothers, identical defendants, would be judged by identical eyes. Third, and this was the decision that would define the entire second trial, Judge Weisberg ruled that the defense would be sharply limited in how much childhood-related testimony it could present. Specific incidents, yes, in narrow form, but the sprawling, weeks-long exploration that had unfolded in the first trial, the family history, the grandparents, the cousins, the slow construction of a lifetime of fear, would not be permitted again. The judge ruled that imperfect self-defense required evidence of a specific, immediate threat. And the broader portrait of family life was, in his judgment, prejudicial. David Conn, the new prosecutor, walked into the second trial with the gift he had been given. He kept the case narrow. The cassette tape, $14 million. Greed. He did not spend weeks on the defendants' childhoods. He did not engage with the defense narrative except to dismiss it. He built a case out of receipts and timelines and forensic evidence, and he built it like a brick wall. Erik Menendez took the stand again. He cried again. He told parts of the same story, but without the full context, without the weeks of build-up, without the ability to bring in the network of relatives and friends who could corroborate the family dynamic. The testimony landed differently. It landed smaller. It landed, to some jurors, as rehearsed. Lyle Menendez, on the advice of his attorneys, did not testify at the second trial. It was a calculated decision. And in hindsight, both the defense team and most legal analysts agree it was the wrong one. The absence of Lyle's voice in the second trial left the jury with nothing to balance against the prosecution's portrait of him as the cold, Rolex-buying, restaurant-purchasing mastermind. Lyle became, in the second trial, a silhouette, and silhouettes do not win juries over. The second jury deliberated for 3 days. On March 20th, 1996, they returned with a verdict. Guilty. Both brothers. Both counts. First-degree murder, with the special circumstance of lying in wait, and the additional special circumstance of multiple counts. The special circumstances mattered enormously. Under California law at the time, they made the brothers eligible for the maximum penalty. The prosecution had sought it. The jury had found them eligible for it. What remained was the penalty phase, a second deliberation, in which the same jurors would decide whether Lyle and Erik Menendez would face the ultimate sentence or spend the rest of their lives in prison with no possibility of parole. The penalty phase was brief, and in it, Leslie Abramson pulled together, in the limited space she had been given, the remnants of the defense she had not been allowed to put on during the guilt phase. Witnesses testified about the brothers' childhoods. Relatives testified about Jose and Kitty. Therapists testified, and on July 2, 1996, the jury returned its penalty recommendation: life in prison without the possibility of parole. For both brothers, Lyle Menendez was 28 years old. Erik Menendez was 25. They were taken out of the Los Angeles County Jail and transported, under heavy security, to the California State Prison System. And here is where the story does something unusual. Because the California Department of Corrections, in making the routine decision about where to house the Menendez brothers, split them up. Lyle was sent to Mule Creek State Prison in Ione, California. Erik was sent, eventually, to Pleasant Valley State Prison, more than 200 miles away. The brothers were not permitted to communicate. They were not permitted to see each other. They were not permitted to write letters at first. Then, for a period, they were permitted to write letters under supervision. Then the letters were restricted again. For 22 years, Lyle and Erik Menendez did not see each other's faces. Not once. They had stood in the same courtroom, sat at the same defense table, heard the same verdict, and then they had been separated as completely as two living brothers in the same state can be separated. Lyle married twice. Erik married once. Their wives carried messages between them. Their attorneys carried messages. The family, what was left of the family, slowly, over years, aged and turned into photographs. In 2018, the California Department of Corrections, citing a change in administrative policy and the brothers' clean disciplinary records, transferred Erik Menendez to the same facility where Lyle was being held, the R.J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Diego. On a Wednesday afternoon, in a visiting yard, Lyle Menendez walked out of a cell block and saw his brother Erik for the first time since 1996. According to a guard who was present, neither brother spoke for about 30 seconds. They just stood there. And then Lyle walked across the yard and embraced Erik. And they stood there, holding each other for what the guard later said felt like several minutes. Neither of them, the guard said, made any sound. They did not cry. They did not speak. They just held on. Lyle was 50 years old at that reunion. Erik was 47. That should have been the end of the story. For almost every convicted American prisoner serving life without parole, that is the end of the story. The case goes quiet. The appeals get filed and denied. The brothers age. The culture moves on. The case becomes a footnote, a documentary, a late-night television rerun, a trivia question. Law schools teach it. Writers write books about it. Everybody else forgets. But the Menendez case refused to stay buried. In 2023, a former member of the 1980s Latin boy band Menudo, a man named Roy Rossello, who had been a preteen member of the band at the height of its fame, gave an extended interview for a documentary series. In that interview, Roy Rossello stated that Jose Menendez, in his capacity as an executive at RCA Records, had personally harmed him when he was a young boy. Rossello named specific details. He described the family home in New Jersey, where the Menendez family had lived before moving to Beverly Hills. He described things that, if true, corroborated the core claim the defense had made in 1993. That Jose Menendez had been someone very different, in private, from the executive the public had known. The Rossello allegations were not admissible as direct evidence. Rossello had never come forward during the original trials. He had never spoken to investigators. But the allegations cracked something open. Attorneys for the Menendez brothers, led by a lawyer named Mark Garagos, filed a petition for resentencing in 2023, citing the Rossello statements as newly discovered evidence, and arguing that if the second trial jury had been permitted to hear the full scope of the defense's original claims, the outcome might have been different. Then came the letter. The letter was found in the personal papers of a deceased cousin of Erik Menendez, a young man named Andy Cano, who had been 13 years old at the time of the events. Cano had passed away in 2003. His mother had kept his possessions in boxes. In 2023, the family, in the course of sorting through the boxes for a documentary project, discovered a letter. It had been written by Erik Menendez to Andy Cano in December of 1988, 8 months before what happened at North Elm Drive. In the letter, teenage Erik Menendez wrote to his younger cousin about specific things happening in the Menendez household, about his father, about his fear, about asking his cousin to keep the letter a secret. The letter, if authentic, and preliminary examinations suggested it was something the first trial had never had. It was a contemporaneous document, a piece of paper written in 1988, when Erik was 17, before any legal strategy existed, before any defense team was involved. The letter described the Menendez family from the inside, before the events, and what the letter described was consistent with what Erik had said on the witness stand in 1993. In October of 2024, the Los Angeles County District Attorney George Gascon held a press conference. He stood in front of reporters, and he said that his office had reviewed the new evidence, had reviewed the original trial record, and had reached a recommendation. He was recommending that Lyle Menendez and Erik Menendez be resentenced. Specifically, Gascon recommended that their sentences be reduced from life without parole to 50 years to life, a sentence that, because the brothers had already served nearly 35 years, would make them immediately eligible for parole. It was not a full exoneration. Gascon did not say the brothers were innocent. He did not say the convictions should be overturned. He said that, in his judgment, the original sentence had been based on an incomplete understanding of the defendants' childhoods, and that the passage of time, combined with the brothers' conduct in prison, both had earned degrees, both had founded prison support groups, both had clean disciplinary records for decades, justified giving them a chance at parole. The announcement detonated. The Menendez family released statements of support. Victims' rights advocates released statements of opposition. Commentators argued on every cable channel in America. The two brothers, now 56 and 53 years old, watched the press conference on a television inside the R.J. Donovan Correctional Facility. And then, in November of 2024, George Gascon lost his bid for re-election. The incoming district attorney, Nathan Hochman, took a more skeptical view of the resentencing petition. The motions Gascon had set in motion did not disappear, they continued, but the political ground beneath them had shifted. As of the time of this recording, the resentencing hearings are ongoing. No final decision has been issued. Lyle Menendez and Erik Menendez remain incarcerated at the R.J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Diego. Their case is being argued, again, in a Los Angeles courtroom, in front of a new judge, in front of a new district attorney, in front of a country that is, for the first time in 35 years, genuinely uncertain about what the right answer is. Now, I want to take you back. I promised you at the start of this episode that I would walk you through the full reconstruction of what happened on the night of August 20th, 1989. I want to do that now. Because before we talk about what the case means, before we talk about whether the brothers deserve a second chance, or deserve to remain in prison, or deserve anything at all, we need to be honest about what they did. And we need to be honest about the context they said they did it in. Here is the reconstruction, assembled from trial testimony, from forensic evidence, from the brothers' own accounts. The week before the events, the Menendez family had returned from a fishing trip on Catalina Island. Jose had chartered a boat called the Motion Picture Marine, The trip had been, by every account, strange. The captain of the boat would later testify that Jose and Kitty had stayed inside the cabin for most of the trip, that the brothers had stayed out on the deck, apart from their parents, fishing in near silence. That the atmosphere on the boat had been, in the captain's word, quote, 3. Lyle Menendez, later, in his jail cell conversations with defense investigators, would describe what had happened on that boat trip in more specific terms. He would say that the trip had been meant as a family reconciliation, that it had not worked, that on the drive back to Beverly Hills, an argument had taken place, that the nature of that argument had convinced Lyle and Erik that something irreparable had shifted in the family. On August 18th, a Friday, 2 days before the events, Lyle and Erik drove to San Diego. They stopped at the Big 5 sporting goods store in a strip mall. They first attempted to purchase handguns. California law required a 15-day waiting period for handguns. The brothers could not wait 15 days. The clerk at Big 5 suggested as an alternative that long firearms could be purchased with no waiting period. The brothers asked for 2 12-gauge models. They used Donovan J. Goodrow's Princeton identification card. They paid in cash. They drove back to Beverly Hills with the purchases in the trunk of a car. On August 20th, Sunday evening, Jose and Kitty Menendez were in the family den. The film The Spy Who Loved Me was in the video cassette recorder. Kitty had made popcorn. Jose was in a reclining chair. Kitty was on a love seat next to him. Erik was in his bedroom upstairs. Lyle was in his bedroom upstairs. Sometime shortly before 10 o'clock, according to the brothers' later account, Lyle and Erik came down the stairs. They were carrying the firearms. They entered the den through the back hallway. They walked into the room behind their parents, who were watching the movie. What happened next lasted less than 20 seconds, according to forensic reconstruction. Both parents were lost. Kitty attempted to move. The brothers continued. When they stopped, Jose and Kitty Menendez were gone. The brothers collected the spent shells from the floor of the den. They took them outside. They got into Lyle's car, a white Ford. They drove up into the hills, up Mulholland Drive. They threw the firearms into a ravine. They threw the shells off a separate cliff. They drove back down into Beverly Hills. They stopped at a gas station to compose themselves. They drove home. They parked the car, and then Lyle picked up the phone in the kitchen, and he dialed 911, and he cried, and he sobbed, and he said, quote 4, "The brothers have since 1993 maintained consistently that in the hours before they walked down those stairs, they had come to believe, based on conversations, based on the atmosphere on the Catalina boat trip, based on a decade of accumulated fear, that their father was preparing to harm them, permanently. That the Friday firearms purchase was not the beginning of a plan, but a desperate reaction to something they were convinced was coming for them. The prosecution has, since 1993, maintained consistently that no such threat existed. That Jose Menendez, whatever kind of man he was behind the gates of North Elm Drive, was not planning to harm his adult sons on the weekend of August 20th, 1989. That the brothers' account of that weekend is a retrofitted justification constructed after arrest, designed to transform a calculated inheritance grab into a story of desperate survival. Both sides have evidence. Neither side has a time machine. And that, in the end, is why this case has refused to settle for 35 years. Because the truth about what Lyle and Erik Menendez believed, in the hours and minutes before they walked down those stairs, is a truth that lives inside two minds. Inside two men who have spent their entire adult lives locked inside California state prisons. The rest of us can only argue about it. I want to tell you something that I have thought about many times while putting this episode together. When the 911 tape from August 20th, 1989 was first played in open court in 1993, the jury heard, behind Lyle Menendez's voice, another voice, quieter, in the background, Erik Menendez. And Erik, on that tape, is making sounds that are not shouts and are not words. They are something closer to a whimper, something closer to what a child sounds like when the child is trying very hard not to be heard. The prosecution, during the first trial, argued that those sounds were performance, that Erik, like Lyle, was rehearsing grief for the dispatcher. The defense argued that those sounds were something else, that what was captured on that cassette was the sound of an 18-year-old boy who had just done something he could not undo, realizing that he was still in the same house where his childhood had happened, and that nothing about that was going to get easier in the hours, days, or decades to come. I have listened to that tape, for the purposes of this episode, more times than I want to admit. And I am not going to tell you which interpretation is correct, because I do not know. Nobody knows. That is the honest answer. But I will tell you this. The Menendez case, when you strip away the Rolex and the Porsche and the Beverly Hills mansion and the Princeton plagiarism scandal and the therapist's mistress and the cassette tape in the safety deposit box, the Menendez case is, at its core, a case about what a jury is willing to believe about what happens inside a family when the family is closed. In 1993, the first jury looked at Lyle and Erik Menendez and looked at the evidence of their childhoods, and it split exactly down the middle. 6 jurors decided the brothers had acted out of calculation. 6 jurors decided the brothers had acted out of fear. In every case, on both panels, the male jurors sided overwhelmingly with calculation. In every case, on both panels, the female jurors sided overwhelmingly with fear. It is tempting to read a lot into that split. Some commentators have. They have said it was about gender perspectives, about different perceptions of family conflict, about who in American society is most prepared to believe stories about hidden cruelty, and who is most prepared to reject them. I am not going to make that argument for you. You can make it for yourself if you think it fits. But the split was real, and it was not random, and it told us something about the country in 1993 that the country was not ready to hear. The second trial, in 1996, simplified the question. The judge removed most of the childhood evidence. The jury looked at what was left, and the jury convicted. Clean, fast, unanimous, and for 30+ years, the convictions stuck. But the country that produced the second verdict is not the country we live in now. The word trauma has entered the language in ways it had not in 1996. The word grooming has entered the language in ways it had not in 1996. Stories that would not have been believable in 1996 are, in 2024, routinely printed on the front pages of national newspapers. Public figures, decades after the fact, are being held accountable for conduct that once was considered unspeakable and therefore unsayable. The question that the Menendez resentencing is really asking is this: if the Menendez brothers were tried today, in 2024, on the same evidence, in front of the same 12 jurors, would the verdict be the same? I do not know the answer. The hearings are ongoing as I record this. A judge will decide, and then another judge, on appeal, may decide something else, and then perhaps a parole board or a governor or the California Supreme Court will weigh in. The machinery of American criminal law grinds slowly. It grinds, often without mercy, but it grinds. What I can tell you is that Lyle Menendez, who is 56 years old as of the recording of this episode, has spent longer inside a California prison than he spent outside of one. What I can tell you is that Erik Menendez, who is 53, has done the same. What I can tell you is that both brothers have, during their 3.5 decades inside, completed college degrees, run mentorship programs for other incarcerated men, founded a hospice support initiative for terminally ill prisoners, and maintained clean disciplinary records. What I can tell you is that the 2 young men who walked out of that Beverly Hills mansion in Tuxedos on August 20th, 1989, no longer exist. The two men waiting in a San Diego courtroom in 2024 are strangers to those young men. What remains of them is, mostly, the fact that they were once in the same family. And what I can tell you is that the case has changed what America believes about families, in ways that the prosecutors in 1996 could not have anticipated, in ways that Leslie Abramson, standing on her step stool in a Van Nuys courtroom in 1993, perhaps did anticipate, but could not prove yet. There is a coda to this episode that I want to share with you, because it is the kind of detail that I think, in the end, tells you more about this case than any of the forensics or the receipts or the therapy tapes. In 2023, when Erik Menendez was transferred to the same facility as his brother, the California Department of Corrections, in an unusual accommodation, allowed the brothers to share a housing unit. Not a cell, they have never shared a cell, but the same dormitory-style building within the prison complex. They see each other every day now. They eat meals together. They play chess in the evenings. A reporter who interviewed a correctional officer at the facility for a podcast that aired in early 2024 asked what the brothers were like in that setting. The officer, who had worked at the prison for 15 years, said something that stayed with me. He said that Lyle and Erik, when you see them together in the common areas, do not look like they are in prison. He said they look like two middle-aged brothers who have been sitting at the same kitchen table for a very long time. Quiet, familiar, not always speaking, but clearly, visibly, at ease in each other's presence, in the way that brothers are at ease with each other, or not at ease with each other, depending entirely on what happened in the house they grew up in. The officer said one more thing. He said that every evening, right before lights out, the two brothers have a small ritual. They stand in the doorway of the dormitory, near each other, and they say goodnight. And then they go to their separate bunks. And then, in the morning, they wake up, and they nod at each other, and they start the day. The officer said it was the most ordinary thing in the world. And it was also, he said, when you thought about it, when you thought about where these two brothers had been, and how long they had been away from each other, and what had happened in the house on North Elm Drive 35 years ago. Maybe the most extraordinary thing he had ever seen inside a prison. I want to leave you with this. The Menendez case is not a case with a clean moral. It is not a case where the guilty are obviously guilty and the innocent are obviously innocent. It is a case that asks the hardest question in American criminal justice, which is the question of how much context a jury is allowed to consider before it reaches a verdict. In 1993, one jury was allowed to consider almost all of the context. That jury could not reach a verdict. In 1996, a second jury was allowed to consider almost none of the context. That jury reached a verdict in 3 days. Both verdicts, in their different ways, were honest. Both verdicts, in their different ways, were incomplete. What happens next, in the resentencing hearings that are unfolding as you listen to this, is going to be the third attempt by the American legal system to answer a question that American legal systems historically have not been good at answering. The question of whether people who do terrible things because terrible things were done to them are the same kind of defendants as people who do terrible things because they want a Rolex. I am not going to tell you what I think. I am not going to tell you what I believe. I'm going to tell you that 35 years after the night at 722 North Elm Drive, America is still arguing. And maybe, that argument is the real verdict. Maybe the fact that we cannot agree, that we cannot close the case, that we cannot stop turning it over and looking at it from new angles every time the culture shifts. Maybe that is the most honest thing any of us can say about the Menendez brothers. They walked into the den in Tuxedos. They called 911 25 minutes later. Their parents were gone. Their childhoods were the defense. Their inheritance was the motive. Their therapist betrayed them. Their first jury believed them. Their second jury convicted them. Their 22 years of separation ended with an embrace in a prison yard. Their case came back in 2023 with a letter from 1988. And the country, 35 years later, is still deciding. That is the Menendez case. That is what we know. That is what we do not know. And that is, I think, what makes it a story that will outlive all of us. This has been Miles, Ghost Hunter. Previous episode, Chandra Levy and the Washington intern, the case of a young woman whose disappearance reshaped an American political career and left a city asking what justice actually means. If you have not heard that one, go back and find it. The Menendez brothers used childhood as their defense. Our next defendant used his badge as his shield. He was a police officer who, from inside a prison cell, tried to silence the prosecutor who caught him. Episode 15, Drew Peterson's second trial. Same channel, same storyteller, same door. Open it when you are ready. Keep the lights on, lock the door, and think carefully tonight about the houses on your street and which ones, behind their gates, are closed in ways that nobody outside will ever see. I am Miles, Ghost Hunter. Good night.